Welcome to the debate here on France 24. 60 years ago, a wave of independence swept across Africa. And the celebrations this week have given people a time to reflect, even mourn, and perhaps regret some of the things that have taken place since self-rule was achieved. It's been the turn this week of Somalia and the Democratic Republic of Congo to mark their independence. Let's take a look at Somalia, for instance. Since breaking free, it's seen the state split, it's seen the civil war, the imposition at one time of Sharia law, and a rise in piracy and Islamist terrorism. And now, though in a better state politically, there are warnings of several famines of biblical proportions coming up. The Democratic Republic of Congo has seen its share of civil conflict too, since it broke away from Belgian rule, a period, of course, of intense bloodshed and cruelty. And earlier this week, Belgium's Prime Minister almost apologised for the atrocities of that period.
L'heure est venue pour la Belgique d'entamer un parcours de recherche, un parcours de vérité, un parcours de mémoire. Tout travail de vérité et de mémoire passe d'abord par la reconnaissance de la souffrance. Reconnaître la souffrance de l'autre. Cette reconnaissance a clairement été exprimée ce matin par notre souverain dans sa lettre au président Tshisekedi pour les Congolais.
So this has been a kind of story reflected across the continent, sadly. And in this debate, we hope to understand more about what's happened and work out what happens next and whether a brighter, better future can be achieved for all. Let's introduce to you our guests for this debate. Joining us from New York is Suleiman Basha Dian, who's director of the Institute of African Studies at Columbia University. Suleiman, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And in Paris, we have three guests. First, Florence Bernot, who is a professor of African history at Sciences Po. Florence, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We have Estelle Youssoufa, who is an international affairs consultant. Hello to you, Estelle. And last but not least, Niagale Bagayoko, who's the chair of the African Security Network. Niagale, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Before I let our guests loose, let's take a look at this report for some more context.
It's a dark and under-examined chapter in Congolese history. In 1885, the country became the personal property of Belgian King Leopold II, who made a fortune from the harvest of a much-prized resource, rubber.
Each village had a quota to meet. If you didn't meet the quota, you were punished. How? They'd cut off your arm.
A barbaric practice which historians say claimed millions of victims, yet has long remained forgotten. That's because when the Congo became a Belgian colony in 1908, Leopold ordered the burning of all state archives. To this day, few historians have written about that period.
The history of a nation must not be concealed. The history of a nation must be passed on from generation to generation. Our children, our grandchildren must learn that history.
That history is largely absent from school curricula in the DRC. Textbooks make hardly any mention of the crimes committed under Leopold II, nor of the system of forced labour implemented by the Belgians.
The place given to calling crimes in the national curriculum is extremely limited. There should be an effort to dig deeper, develop new materials, and ultimately change the national curriculum.
The legacy of colonial rule is not only absent from textbooks, it's left few visible traces.
This monument was dedicated to King Albert. There was a statue right in front of it, mounted on steel rods, which you can see right there.
Statues of colonial rulers in the DRC were toppled after independence in 1960, but some people say they should be reinstated. This politician believes that breaking from Congo's past like this has obscured understanding of the lasting impact of colonialism.
You can't replace history with nothing. The statues were removed. But then what happened? We've been colonized, we must accept it and we must try to live with it.
Some statues are now on display at the National Museum in Kinshasa. Meanwhile, insecurity, economic exploitation and political instability continue to weigh on the nation's progress.
Clement Bono is our reporter there with that look at what's happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Let's bring in our guests. Suleiman in New York, I'll start with you if that's okay. The situation that, as we're looking at it now, marking 60 years of independence, what are your feelings about how Africa has fared over the past 6 decades?
Well, Africa has gone through different phases. You had what we might call the lyrical illusion following independence. And then you had a time of disillusionment, probably, we could call it like that, when we had Africa witnessed dictatorships, some of them totally mad. The madness of leadership is something that Africa, unfortunately, has experienced. I'm thinking of Jean Bedel Bokassa, who was the embodiment of a mad dictator. But Africa has also known certain development. It has been documented. We know now that during the past 30 years, for example, Africa has tripled its middle class. We have to look at those aspects also of what was happening in Africa. We should not be trapped by the fact that the discourse about Africa being the continent of tragedies, of continent of suffering, continent of civil wars, etc., which is all true. We do not want that discourse to obscure what was also happening on the ground, which is a certain development of Africa measured by the tripling of its middle class during the past 30 years. And that middle class has been a decisive agent when it came to making political changes. Africa was at one point considered the continent forgotten by human rights. That's not true anymore. The continent forgotten by democracy. That is not true anymore. You have many places where you have political change happening in peaceful ways, etc. So we have to make sure that we are not trapped by the old discourse about Africa, the lost continent, the suffering continent, coming back again to the suffering of colonialism, which was absolutely horrible. And probably Congo is the worst possible example, because as we know, the Congo was not just a colony, it was the private property of King Leopold II.
Indeed, and some of the things, of course, that went on and things that the Belgian Prime Minister was talking about were completely horrific. Suleiman, thank you for the moment. Can I just bring up the case of Somalia, and let's look at some facts about Somalia and its position. I mean, clearly, when we talk about the bad things, and as a journalist, perhaps we are the ones who in some ways to blame, because we tend to report on bad things. It's the nature of the beast, sadly. When you look at what happens in Somalia, you look at the breakdown of life in Somalia, the facts there, it does look bleak. Florence, can I bring you in to talk about that situation, about how things are there, about this idea of things getting better, but somehow it seems that when you look at what happens to Somalia, it never seems to get better.
Yeah, I think Somalia is a really difficult situation, and it's a very painful situation. But I think it's really important, as Suleiman Bashir Dian reminded us, to look at decolonization and independence as a process. If you look at the history of the West, if you look at the history of Europe, if you look at the history of the Americas, we and they also go through phases of war, of conflict, of extremely bad situations when it comes to human rights. So I think it's really important to keep these situations into perspective. And also, I think we sometimes tend to look at the failure or the problems with the governing elites, but we don't always remember and know about the very large movements in Africa, political activists, human rights activists, people who really try to construct and to invent a different kind of Africa. So as a historian, we always try to look over the longer term. And it seems to me that if we don't keep that kind of perspective in mind, then it's kind of easy to build a narrative that I would call Afro-pessimistic, where you focus on the crisis and the tragedies, sort of, jumping all over different parts of Africa and taking that as, in a way, a case that allows a kind of general discourse of the failure of independence. We could, as again Suleiman reminded us, focus also on stories of success in Africa.
Indeed, those stories of success, though, when you highlight them compared to some of the tragedies, it's easy to see why the media, and I'm as guilty as anybody in the media, goes with those stories that tell the bad side of what is happening. Estelle, can I bring you in to sort of, again, talk more about the issues relating to Somalia? I mean, clearly now facing another famine situation, according to the World Food Programme, many more people at risk. And again, it seems to go from bad to worse. Now, it's good to look for positive things, but how do you start to correct those negative things against Somalia facing another tragedy?
So I think that food security is not a problem just for Somalia. It's the eastern side of the continent, which is really struggling for the next months. And one can blame Mother Nature and climate change, but there's also the COVID-19 and the interruption of the value chains and the logistic lines, which really deeply disrupted the food security and the food systems as a whole. But I think that if we look at it through political lenses, as you're trying to angle it, I would think that it's interesting to think of on the longer term and remember that Somalia is if we talk about decolonization, then obviously it's the borders. It's what is Somalia in terms of where is it coming from, and can you build a state which is in a way somehow artificial. Somalia is a former Italian, partly under British rule, and is it something, and then if you talk about the past decades, then it's about breakaway provinces, it's about rivalries, it's about different armed groups. And then it's also about regional powers intervening in Somalia, as well as Western powers. Everyone remembers the Black Hawk Down movie, where you had American interests. Now the discussion in Somalia is also around competing Middle Eastern Gulf countries, which are using Somalia as a playground and a place where they solve their own different rivalries. So I think that the discussion around decolonization is also about who allows African countries to be themselves and to find their own solutions. That's what the previous speaker mentioned. It's a process. Now, is Africa allowed to actually find its own solution? And then when I say allowed, is it given room to do so, to experiment, to try? I think that the legacy of colonialism is not just about symbols. It's about how do you manage to have really independent elites, ruling powers, and then it's also about exploration. It's not just about politics. It's about how do you build growth that is indigenous? How do you have fair economic relations with the former colonial powers? And that's really what is at stake today. Once you have that generation of independent fighters who left power, now it's about economic liberation for Africa.
Indeed, that aspect of how does Africa grow is extremely important, isn't it? Colonialization ended, perhaps not setting down any kind of roadmap towards properly ruling and developing the countries, which led to perhaps many of the issues that have developed over the past 60 years. Suleiman talked about dictatorship. I think it's obviously something that has been witnessed along with the atrocities that go along with that. Staying with Somalia for a second, there's a massive Turkish military base there. You talk about, Estelle, about people coming in and having their sort of stake in what goes on in any particular African country and maybe suppressing the possibility of growth. Niagale, can I bring you in to talk about this issue of security? Is it important to have, say, in Somalia, a Turkish presence like that? Or should some kind of internal way of securing the country be the aim?
First, I would like to say that it is very important not to consider Africa as a whole. You know, Africa is not this big country. I think there are a lot of differences between different areas. Also, those differences are coming from the kind of colonization which have been influence in the different regions of the continent. And you were mentioning Belgium colonization, which was very peculiar. And as regards Somalia, I think also it is important to consider it with its different parts, you know, because the country fell apart almost 30 years ago. And now you have the Puntland region, you have the Somaliland, which is not recognized at the international level, or at least but not all the actors. And the kind of development of those different areas is very interesting to look at. For instance, Somaliland has developed very vernacular governance mechanisms, sometimes with the support of Gulf countries. It's important to mention it, but also referring to its own historical and customary mechanisms, including to set up a new parliament. So that's very important to consider local actors. So Turkey is, of course, an important actor, and international actors are key, in particular in the security realm on the African continent. But I think there is really a need to also put the stress on the kind of grassroots level and Africanized solution, which in fact are also at stake, and which can function sometimes in some part of the continent.
We were going to talk more about this in a moment. Let's turn to some of the human stories behind the colonialization experience. We have a Reporters Plus documentary, which is airing very soon, about the effect of colonization on children, fathered by white colonialists with African women, who basically then didn't assume their responsibilities. These children sent to orphanages. Let's take a look at a little segment from our documentary.
Il n'est pas connu mon père. Il n'est pas trop et moi j'étais encore bébé. Je suis dans que mon père a participé à la création de ce jardin botanique. Il était ensuite affecté au Bénin pour toujours dans le cadre de la création des familles à ville. Et puis moi je n'ai pas connu. Hein.
Mes fils me demandent même, mais pourquoi le papy, il est blanc? Pourquoi il est blanc et puis ses autres frères sont noirs? Bon, il faut expliquer. Et les enfants, ils posent des questions. Des fois, moi, je n'ai pas les réponses, mais bon, et c'est des questions souvent embarrassantes. Bon, l'histoire a été cachée, c'était caché dans un tiroir, dans un placard, enfermé dans un placard pour ne pas que l'opinion publique sache.
André Moncke spent his childhood here in the orphanage overlooking the botanical garden in Banjaville, Ivory Coast. He'd just turned 10 when he first arrived at his strange new home. To get there, he travelled for hours on foot, escorted by colonial guards. This was in 1939, more than 80 years ago, but he remembers it like it was yesterday.
Je le vois tout en larmes. Avec beaucoup d'émotions.
Ça m'a touché, quoi. Ça m'a pas beaucoup de souvenirs.
The Reporters Plus documentary series, you can see it in full on our website at france24.com. Let's bring the panel back in to talk more about these issues. I think we can see from that there's a recurring theme about exploitation, not assuming responsibilities, taking whatever they want out of Africa and moving on and just basically enjoying the spoils. But the human cost, Suleiman, can I bring you in to talk about this? What we saw from the gentleman featured in our documentary is how lives have been ruined, basically.
Well, indeed, and this situation is very well described by another Métis, famous Métis from the Congo, who is the writer and statesman Henri Lopez. Henri Lopez, who has ended his career being the ambassador of Congo in France. But of course, when you have this kind of colonial situation, you have these encounters also among the people, and with this kind of tragedy. And I understand that in Belgium, this has been a very tragic situation when very often fathers leaving the continent have taken the children from their mothers, and once in Belgium have not really raised them, but instead given them away as foster children, basically, and so on and so forth. But again, you have a very contrasted situation when it comes to this Métis population, as we might call it. I am from a city called Saint-Louis, in Senegal. Saint-Louis is a very Métis city. Saint-Louisian names would be Valentin, Guillabert, Barbier, but also Benjeloun, etc. So situations are totally different. In West Africa, you have many Métis people who, instead of leaving their situation as a tragedy, actually have played very important political role. Gabriel Darboussier, who was a co-founder with Félix Houphouët-Boigny of the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, was a Métis. So again, the situation of métissage is to be seen through different lenses and in different areas and different situations. The Congolese situation, as we know it now, because it is being documented, all these people who had been taken back to Belgium, taken from their mothers, etc., are telling their stories. These stories were not heard before. But if you want to look at the human significance of the encounter between Europeans and Africans, we have again to look at the broad picture and look at what the sociology of the Métis were. I know that there is a book coming out on Gabriel Darboussier, which is also a very interesting study of that topic.
Suleiman, I need to stop you and bring another guest who needs to. Thank you very much indeed. Florence, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I want to say, besides the personal tragedies, that it was also, as the little reminder said, that it was a kind of institutional tragedy, and it was a policy that has been very well documented, not only by witnesses like Darboussier or Lopez, but also by historians. And the problem of the Métis from a political history and institutional history viewpoint is that the Métis were threatening the racial divide between Europeans, white people with immense political and social privileges, and of course Africans who were at the time called the subjects without any kind of political or social rights. So oftentimes the state was really intervening, as you see in those orphanages. Sometimes the children were taken away from their mothers, African mothers, in order for the state to make sure that this population, again, would not sort of threaten or blur or undermine.
And often the African mothers, as I understand, shunned by their villages, shunned by their families, which is obviously reinforcing the pain of what's happened.
I think the situation is much more complicated, as Suleiman Bachchandian reminded us. Sometimes it was actually seen as a fairly prestigious thing to have been in a relationship with a white man. In a very few cases, those white fathers actually recognized their children, they fought for them, and you have a number of very good histories. I'm thinking about Karina Ray for Ghana, I'm thinking about Emmanuel Sada, not in Africa, but in Indochina, who have looked at those stories.
Indeed, and some would say that those fathers should fight for their children and they should pay for their children, they should assume responsibility. Estelle, you wanted to join the conversation?
Yeah, I think that Florence Bernoud raised a very interesting point about what mixed race people symbolizes, and I am one. So speaking from experience, I must say that we're talking about today, the traces of that racial divide is obviously, and if we talk especially about West Africa, is colorism. So in a way, Florence touched on that issue, but being mixed race, being light skin, fair skin, is actually in some societies seen as more prestigious because closer to the former colonial power, and it's a very ambiguous relation, and it goes back to today, obviously, because it dates back to slavery and it lives on. It's interesting that this week, no later than this week, L'Oréal actually said it would change the way it's presenting its skin products to say not to mention whitening because of the political weight behind it. So I think that legacy lives on, and it's a very very complex legacy, because it's both obviously sometimes these children were coming from rape, but also from love stories. It's also, if one wants to talk about colonialism and slavery, there's also all the cultural legacy that lives on both in Africa as well as in Europe. And I think that what is actually needed today is a more subtle reading, a more broad investigation of that past, probably because I sit on both sides. I would think that there is some positive, but I think that it's possible to discuss the positive aspects if one recognizes the suffering. You're talking about children being taken from their family, but it's also about being cut from their African heritage. It's also on the other side, being cut from their European heritage, being recognized as a European person from their father's side, if we're talking about that. And mentioning that, I would insist on the fact that we're talking about children being fathered by European men, because sexual relationships between an African man and a European woman would send a person to death. So it was a crime, and therefore, in a way, it's interesting to remember that mixed race people are in many countries seen as crimes. That's the title of Trevor Noah's book, where he explains that, for example, in South Africa, being mixed race was illegal.
Estelle, thank you very much indeed. Niagale, can I bring you in on the same topic? The way these children were treated clearly is, I think by anybody's standards, horrific. But clearly, for some good came out of it in spite of it all, but for others, lives were ruined.
Yes, I think, of course, it is one of the most important legacy. And here again, I think it is important to make a difference between the different regions in the continent. For instance, what happened in Lusophone countries, and which were under the rule of Portugal, was different from what was happening in the French colonial empire or in the British colonial empire. And the legacy are also different, and the métissage, the métis in Lusophone Africa are seen in different ways, sometimes as they have been seen in other parts of Africa. So here again, I would say, let's try to make differentiation, but also try to, I'm not an historian, but also to write history from a personal, individual perspective, but also from an institutional one, because this kind of métissage, in fact, is not really recognized at an institutional level today, and I think it is something which has to be thought about.
Niagale, thank you very much indeed. There are lots of bad things going on, as we have said. There are wars. There are people who are struggling to make ends meet. There are refugees. There is famine. There are also some very good things that some of our guests have been talking about. Let's now hear from someone who I think is one of the great things to come out of Africa, the Senegalese singer Youssou N'Dour.
J'ai vu une photo I saw a photo of the first festival of African art organized here in Senegal. I had the chance to see the poster. On the poster, there were a few buildings around the port of Dakar, but next to it was a piece of art. And that is what really sold Senegal. How Senghor sold Senegal as a destination to attract people to visit the festival.
Les gens autour du festival des Arts Nègres.
Let's talk about the next phase then. We've had 60 years since independence. We had the colonial aspects before that. The hangover of that throughout the past 60 years, I suspect, setting up some of the bad things we've seen. What about the next 60 years? Youssou N'Dour hoping for something better, I think, in what he's talking about there, about the festival aspect, about the cultural aspects. Let's turn to our guests and see how they see the next 60 years developing. What are the factors that need to happen, the things that need to take place to create a better Africa as a whole continent and as individual countries and as individual villages? Suleiman, I'll give you the privilege of going first, sir.
Well, thank you very much. What I would say is that the good trends that we have seen in Africa in the past decade, let's say, have to be continued. To just give you an example, at the end of the 90s, The Economist had a title about Africa being the lost continent. 10 years later, The Economist had a title about Africa, the rising continent. And lately, just before the fallout coming out of this pandemic, unfortunately, lately Africa was considered the new frontier with good growth rates and so on, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully when this world, which is under attack, under the attack of the COVID-19 is over, we will be able to continue along those lines. As I said, if we look at Africa as a whole, you can look at the tragedies here and there. Africa is not one country, it is not two countries, it is not three countries, it is 54 different countries and different contrasted regions and so on. So human rights have been developing, democracy have been developing, growth rates have been there. As I said, the middle class is a very productive, innovative middle class. And the culture of Africa, Youssou N'Dour is a great example of this capacity of innovation and also entrepreneurship. He's a great entrepreneur, et cetera, et cetera. That Africa needs to develop because Africa is at the crossroads. You have all the tragedies that we have been talking about. You have also these good trends, and hopefully the good trends are going to bring the change that the continent needs to see.
Suleiman, thank you very much indeed. Florence, what would you see as the key thing that has to happen to start creating a better Africa, a better deal for everybody?
Yeah, it's a funny question. It's like, what silver bullet do you have to do that? I would say that, I think this the show showed us actually that one of the things is to be aware and acknowledge the enduring connection between Africa and the rest of the world, and in particular with former colonial nations. And I think, we started with the quasi-apologies of the King of Belgium. I think it seems perhaps a bit paradoxical, but to go back into the past, to acknowledge this past, to research this past, and also to draw lessons from this past, to also see how the connections today that are economic, that are political, that are diplomatic, security connections between those colonial nations or former colonial nations in Africa probably needs to be redefined, because behind the facade of decolonization and independence, some of these links can be sometimes very detrimental to Africa. Still, even though at the grassroots we see these middle class politicians, activists really trying and oftentimes succeeding in making the future of Africa better. So last thing that I would like to say is precisely to try on the side of former colonial nations, or even, I would say outside audiences looking at Africa, to stop being really sort of imbued with this very negative image of Africa, with this kind of Afro-pessimism I was talking about, which look at Africa as this dark continent full of tragedies with no future. What we know is that the only thing we can expect is the unexpected, and there have been a number of long-term trends towards development, towards better human rights, and very interesting cultural and social initiatives.
Florence, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Estelle. The question for you, Estelle, do you think, given that Africa needs its partners going forward, China already a key partner, is China making things better or making things worse in your eyes going forward? You were talking earlier about maybe Africa not being allowed to grow as itself, and maybe China's role, perhaps maybe sort of a continuation of that.
So China has been very helpful for Africa because it broke the tête-à-tête with African countries and their former colonial power. If you have multiple partners around the table, therefore you have what capitalism calls for, which is competition. Now, what is very interesting is that recently you could see the EU trying to negotiate its way back with African powers to stay with the African Union. That negotiations, you have currently the ACP trade and political talks that are to replace the Cotonou Agreement that are taking place and that Brussels is hoping to conclude in the coming months. So there hasn't been just satisfaction from European partners to see China playing a more and more important role in Africa. But in the post-COVID-19 world, that can be put into question because there are questions in China around about its investments in Africa. Some say it should recoup its investments, and that would turn off the tap for some African countries. So I think that for Africa, you asked, if what would make the future brighter for Africa if we talk about the next 60 years. I think it's for African leaders to walk their talk. I think that there is a huge pressure in the African streets to actually have their leaders champion their demands, their rights for fair, better trade deals, and to have a growth that actually trickles down. Because the problem for the past decades for Africa is, yes, it's about fantastic growth, but does it change the life of the men and the women on the street? And I think that I want to really emphasize what Florence Bernot said about African pessimism. There is such a gap between what Africa lives and what is the reality for the African continent and what is the perception of what Africa is. That is just, it's gobsmacking, meaning that for Africans, it's a continent of dynamism, inventivity, creativity, fantastic resilience, and loads of genius ideas and invention. And there is this youth that pushes for change. And the perception of the continent around the world is gloom and doom, which does not correspond to what Africans perceive on themselves. And I think that it's about time for the rest of the world to change the way they see the continent, because I think, and I'm an Afro-optimist to the core, I think that 21st century will be indeed African. And I think it's it's time for the rest of the world to realize that.
Indeed. And part of that, of course, is getting security. Let's bring in our security analyst, Niagale, to talk about that. The next stage, there can't be peace and prosperity and growth without security, can there?
Absolutely. It is, of course, a key aspect, even if I am also optimistic for the future of Africa. I think we cannot look at what is happening at the security level on the continent. And I definitely consider that the future of Africa is to develop its own perspective on security, because one of the less decolonized area has been security. In particular, in French-speaking Africa, there has been a lot of dependence to the former colonial power. And today, I think there is definitely a dire need to develop an African perspective on security, which means not only refer to the state-centric and the state-to-state competition approach to security, but also to refer to historical references in this area, and also to develop a more people-centered perspective, also to refer to the now very numerous experiences from an operational point of view. And there is a need to develop doctrines, to develop national security strategies which are well grounded in an African thinking. And there are international multilateral organization on the continent, for instance, of course, the African Union, but also the RECs, the regional economic communities, which should be involved in such an exercise, which should also get in the states themselves, of course, but also African civil society, because security is also a common good, and civil society has a word to say about it.
Niagale Bagayoko, we'll end it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Niagale. Thanks to Estelle Youssoufzef, the International Affairs Consultant. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to Florence Bernot from the Professor of African History at Sciences Po. And thanks to Suleiman, joined us in New York, Suleiman Bashir Dian, who's the Director of the Institute of African Studies at Columbia University. Thanks to all our guests. Here's to the next 60 years in Africa. Let's hope it's peaceful, prosperous, and it's great for everybody. Thank you for watching this program. Stay with us. You're watching France 24.
It may be a cliche, but we truly are living through extraordinary times. COVID-19, climate change, a global movement against racism. Here on France 24, we want to bring you the human stories behind the headlines. The program is called The New Normal, and it features original reporting every week from France 24's correspondents all around the world.
The New Normal on France 24 and France24.com.